will be presented by Dr. Aurora Elmore. And this session is sponsored by the Tysons Partnership, so thank you, Tysons Partnership. Dr. Elmore is a geologist. She's a climate change expert. She's the senior program officer at National Geographic. She's written a number of papers and given presentations on climate change throughout the country. So we are very happy to have her here today, and she's going to tell us a little bit more about what the current science says about climate change and who's making a positive impact.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is such a treat for me. To begin, I'd like to be honest with you, because that's my policy always. I am often invited to speak with either nerdy climate change scientists, and we get real nerdy. We talk about isotopes and mass spectrometers and how we know what we know about climate change. And the other group I'm often invited to talk to is children. So this is a really special group for me to speak with for a few different reasons. The first is my name is Aurora, which some of you might surmise means I have very hippie parents. And it's true. I grew up on, let's just say, a hippie commune light in the middle of nowhere, Maine. We grew up in a house that my dad built from scratch. It was all about living off the land, being sustainable, and so that's the way I was raised. And throughout my career, I've always thought that it's very important the way people identify with their environments. It's really what defines us as a culture. The second reason why I'm really excited to talk to you today is that this was my grandfather, who was the founding dean of architecture at Arizona State and was, I'm told, a bit of a revolutionary, thinking about things like aerial rail and how to build sustainable architecture in the middle of Arizona back in the 50s and 60s. So this is a really fun group for me to be able to speak with, since I have personal ties to the architecture and sustainability environment. So the reason why I'm here today is to talk to you about climate change. And given your passion and your enthusiasm for finding solutions to climate change, I would expect that many of you know quite a bit about it. But I'd like to know how many of you know a climate scientist? Okay. I count, yeah. You all know me now, so everyone can raise your hands. I'm happy to be your personal climate scientist. And I find that even among my friends, very few of them have ever talked to a climate scientist about exactly what we know and how we know it. So I'm happy to share that information with you today. Climate change is a huge problem. No matter who you are, where you live in the world, what your religious or your anything about you, no matter what you do all day, no matter what your career is, climate change is affecting you. Whether you are a rural person who is experiencing directly changes in agriculture, if you're someone who lives in an urban environment and you're dealing with focuses on how to change the sustainability and energy uses that you have, you may face an increase in diseases, water shortages, even the increase in price that we'll find from agriculture being more difficult. If you live on the coast, you might experience glacial melt that's causing sea level to rise. We're expecting within the next 100 years, there'll be millions of climate refugees who are moving from the coast just a little bit inland to protect themselves from sea level rise. If you live in the mountains, you may experience increased seasonality, less fresh water. If you are someone who is elderly or care for people who are elderly, the increase in heat-related deaths is going to be exponential. If you are young, you're inheriting an unstable ecosystem. No matter who you are, climate change is going to affect you. I'd like this to be a bit of a sunny presentation, and I want to tell you all that we're going to be fine. And thanks to the last presentation that Mike gave, the technology is mind-blowing, that we will be able to move people from the coast to higher levels. We will be able to come up with new inoculations against the diseases that will become more prevalent. We're going to be okay. But there's some people who won't be okay. And in particular, poorer, rural, and low-lying countries, such as Bangladesh, Cambodia, these are the places, Indonesia, where climate change is going to affect them in ways that they will not be able to recover. And this is something that we all should care about. Your life may become more difficult, their lives will become unlivable. This is why we do what we do. This is why you're all trying to get sustainable solutions that are also scalable, that can be shared with the rest of the world. So much of what we know about recent climate change comes from technology, comes from satellites, continuous monitoring using really high precision instruments, using altimeters, using even personal accounts. And I'm sure quite a lot of you in this room have your own personal story about climate change, about a season with a particularly bad winter. As someone who grew up in Maine, we have a really bad winter everyone talks about. Or a particular time when you think temperatures have been rising through your lifetime. These are a lot of what's shown on the news, a lot of what non-scientists talk about when they think about climate change is relatively recent. And it's very important to put that recent change into a larger context. And that's what I do for my job. One way that we can look at climate change over a long period of time is to look at the ice. Ice, particularly in the polar regions, though also on top of mountains, traps atmosphere as it moves from being snow to being compacted into ice. You get little tiny bubbles of whatever the atmosphere was at the time when that snow fell. So we can get a record of past CO2 conditions, past methane, the greenhouse gases that we all know are critically important to understand. We can also look at the expanse of ice by tracking moraines, which are the bulldozed effects of a glacier as it expands across a continent. As the glacier moves, it pushes all of the sand and mud to the edge of its borders. That's called a moraine, and we can map those to look at how large ice was in the past and relate that to changes in climate. Those are both really great ways to look at past climate, but there's actually a better way. And I'd like you to use your imagination a little bit. This is a little guy living in the Galapagos, and I'd like you to imagine that you're him. This is a seagoing iguana, so he can go from land to sea. And if you're this iguana and you swim out to the middle of the ocean, you might find that there are little pieces of dust and sediment. I'm sure we've all been swimming and know that the ocean is not always crystal clear. There's dust that's been windblown. There's sediments that are little pieces of rocks that are transported from the continent out into the middle of the ocean. If you're in a cold place, you might also have some icebergs, which bring a lot of sediment and mud along with them out to the ocean. You also have things that live in the ocean. These are plants and animals on a very tiny scale. And I'm going to be talking about scale quite a lot during this presentation. These are called foraminifera. They're the size of the point of a pin. So these are teeny, teeny unicellular animals. And as they die, which takes roughly a week, they settle to the bottom of the ocean. And this builds up a continuous record of everything that's happened in the overlying water column. These are called foraminifera. And they all look different, a bit bulbous. I like to think of them as popcorn. Some of them live in the surface of the ocean. Some of them live deep in the ocean. And what is so important about them is that they preserve a record of everything that's happened in the past. These are little tiny time machines. So if you take a boat out to the middle of the ocean and you put a giant straw down into the ocean mud, you get this layered appearance that is a record, an annual record of everything that's happened in the overlying water column. And we've taken big boats out to lots of places in the ocean. Then these cores get stored in big repositories all over the world. And these foraminifera, these teeny tiny organisms, they are what they eat, just like we are what we eat. They can tell you information about the salinity of the ocean, the amount of nutrients, where the water came from, how the ocean circulates, how the ocean circulates, and also how much CO2 is dissolved in the ocean. One particular proxy that we can use from these foraminifera is that their chemical composition is directly related to temperature. And I think this is something we can all agree happens. Does anyone get a bit hangry? Maybe when you're hot or maybe when you're cold, you want to eat something different. You know, it's starting to get a bit cold out in DC. I had a big bowl of soup last night. It just felt right. These little tiny forams eat different things, they consume different things, and their bones, their calcite that gets left behind when they die, records everything that they have lived through. So if you pick them out of the mud and you analyze them using really high precision mass spectrometers, you get a record that looks like this, wiggles. And I'm not expecting any of you to get real excited about this, but this is a point in a typical presentation to nerdy scientists that people get really excited, just so you know what you're missing out on. So these wiggles represent the last 1.1 million years of climate history. And present day for this plot is over on the left, and 1 million years ago is over to the right. And what's really important for you to see is that these go up and down. In the black line, we have a stacked record of all of the deep-dwelling foraminifera. So this is a proxy for what happens in the deep ocean, a pretty regulated region. In the green is what happens in a particular region in the deep ocean. In the red is an intermediate section of the ocean. We're getting nerdy, I know. What's important is that all of these records show a lot of similarities. A lot of the highs match highs in other records. A lot of places throughout the ocean have very similar records over the last 1 million years. And we can also look at the ice records compared with the ocean records. And what we see is that this sawtooth pattern, this up and down wiggles of climate in the past are all pretty similar. There's a lot of similarity between, at the top, atmospheric CO2. In red, average global temperature. In green, the amount of methane. And down at the bottom in orange, incoming solar radiation. And this is how scientists like myself understand that climate before humans had a lot of changes, a lot of variability. But it went up and down, warm and cold, based on how the Earth moves around the sun. All of this is before 1800. You have this direct relationship between CO2, methane, temperature, and incoming solar radiation. This is all what we consider to be natural cycles that happen within climate change. As I'm sure you know, humans are a recent addition. So the Earth is about 5.45 billion years old. Humans in our current form have existed for only about 200,000 years. Seems like a long time. When we think about the pace of technology, that is a crazy amount of time. But really, everything we know about how climate works, about the different cycles, the feedback loops, about everything within our Earth system is pretty well understood before humans come along and start messing things up. And this is something that humans are really good at. We have been messing things up since the beginning of time, or the beginning of human time. And we do it in a lot of different ways. The first is we cultivate and irrigate and create agriculture. The cultivation of rice started in China about 6,000 years ago. And this changed how This changed how the cycles of water move CO2, move carbon around that local region. On a very large scale, this impacts our climate today, even though it's something that started a long time ago. Humans are very good at utilizing all available resources. We do it with rare earth elements that make up your cell phone. We do it with rocks in these troglodyte caves from eastern Turkey, where people, by hand, carved their homes out of solid rock. We use all of the resources that we can to our advantage. This is a picture of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. It's the largest religious complex in the world. And large building projects are one of the ways that humans are constantly changing everything about our environment. Whether it's changing the way water moves around the water cycle, in this case, that beautiful pond that lets you view the sunrise through this amazing architecture is man-made. It's a created pond specifically so that we can see this reflection that they thought to make for us in about the 1400s. Very nice of them for photography. Another thing that humans have been doing for a really long time is capturing solar energy. This is some terraces in Pisac, Peru, and they are all made to face specifically the solar peak in order to get the most incoming radiation to grow crops in what is basically a very cold region of the mountains in Peru. So humans have been changing their environment for a very long time, and we've gotten really good at it. With the onset of the Industrial Revolution in 1850, we started changing the environment on a massive scale. Population's now 7.4 billion in 2017. It has been rising really drastically. I think we'll be at 7.5 billion by March of next year, according to some accounts. This is when humans started really changing climate. So here's the same picture that I showed you before. This is the plot of CO2 and methane and global temperature, along with, on the bottom, the natural insulation, our energy that comes from the sun. And what we've drawn here in the little blue squiggles and green squiggles is how CO2 is rising off the charts. Someone made this figure in 2004. It's now out of date. We now have 404.33 parts per million of CO2 in our atmosphere. This is double what we'd expect, right? If we know how climate changes up and down based on the natural processes with our Earth, CO2 is now off the charts. Now, I've been doom and gloom. Here are 7 things to know about climate change. It's a little presentation that National Geographic put together that we can roll. Yeah, so there's a lot of controversy around climate change. I'm here to tell you the world is getting warmer. This animation shows you global temperatures as they increase from 1850 moving forward to today. You see that the colors get warmer and warmer and warmer. This is the range of deviated temperatures based on the average in 1960. Temperatures are getting warmer. It's because of us. When you look at CO2 from 1870 on the left, 1960 in the middle, and 2016 on the right, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased again off the charts. It's the same plot we were looking at just before. Carbon dioxide warms the planet. We are sure. I'm here. I'm now the only climate scientist many of you know. So 100% of the climate scientists you know. But really, 98% of climate scientists in the world are sure that climate change is man-made. The fourth thing we know is that ice is melting fast. Satellite records, humans who have been taking individual measurements, anecdotes, everything tells us that ice is melting because the Earth is getting warmer. Weather is wreaking havoc. The amount of storms, wildfires, and floods have all been increasing. This was made in last year. As I'm sure you all know, 2017 has been even more horrific. So that will only get worse. Species are being disrupted. Animals and plants have already vanished from a lot of locations around the world. Anywhere where they were pushed to their brink on sort of the warmer end, they are no longer able to be found. This is really important because if we urbanize those regions, the animals have nowhere to go. Point number 7 is that we can do something. And there are a lot of people working on this. The more we focus on renewable energy, which is already increasing, the more we focus on keeping everyone sustainable, the better chance we have for success. This is an everyone problem. And that's the good news. That I showed you some pictures before of humans messing up their environment, controlling their environment. The other good news about humans is that we are resilient. This is a picture of a village along the Amazon in Peru. And people in this region have been building their houses on sticks for hundreds of years. Long before anthropogenic climate change or human-caused climate change, people knew that when the El Nino rains came, the water level rose, and they needed to be prepared. And as humans, we are great at this. We're very resilient. The other good news is all of the technology, which we just had a really great presentation on all of the amazing technology that's still to come. The good news is that we are able to address this problem head on, that we can think about how technology will help to keep our Earth sustainable. My job at National Geographic is to support people with bold and transformative ideas to generate a more sustainable and healthier Earth. And I'd like to introduce you to a few of these people. The first is Arthur Huang. And this quote says that people sometimes talk about green, but, gosh, I can't even read it. That's quite hard to read, sorry. But in truth, the actual implementation has not caught up to the consciousness of consumers. We are trying to bridge that gap. Arthur is one of our emerging explorers at National Geographic, and he focuses on changing trash into useful materials. So he's standing right there in front of a building that he built using only plastic bottles. And the entire structure of this building is from reused and recycled materials. He has some great technologies for breaking down plastic bottles into little chips that then become new building products in order to reuse them in a sustainable way. Hindu Ibrahim is another one of our emerging explorers. She co-developed a project that combined 3D mapping tools with local knowledge to manage the environment, give voices to indigenous people, especially women, on climate adaptation and mitigation. She comes from Chad, in a region that is going to be drastically affected by climate change. And many of her family and friends are pastoralists. And she works with them to implement new strategies for how climate change can affect them and how they can work around what will be a changing environment. The third person I'd like to introduce you to is Yu Gao. And Yu Gao also provided us a quote. He does some really fantastic work to increase the ability of electric cars to be used. A lot of people have the complaint that electric cars don't have good pickup, that they can't drive very fast right off the line. And he works on a new type of lithium-ion battery that can put more energy into your car right away. It charges faster, and it enables that faster pickup in cars that everyone's looking for, in the hopes that more people will start driving electric cars and using that technology. There are lots of climate success stories, and I know that you all know some. And I also know that we all have an obligation to educate everyone. Education is one of the most important things that we can do to combat climate change. We can share sustainable solutions at forums like this, and also with your colleagues, and also with your friends, and also with everyone you know. Share your sustainable solutions. Use your purchasing power to always be thinking about what decisions you can make in order to lead us to a healthier and more sustainable Earth system. And just keep educating the public. Make sure that everyone understands that this is a problem that needs to be faced, that we have solutions, we're working on even better, even more exciting solutions, and that it can always be something to learn from. One piece that I would like to share with you is a little cartoon about what you can do. And I'd like for you to take a moment to speak to your colleague next to you and ask what they're doing. This is one of the things I find most interesting. I have friends who have given up eating meat, who have decided to not fly, who have made choices in their lives with the particular aim of combating climate change, of making their small step. And I'd like for you to share with your neighbor what you have done personally to tackle the climate change question. So I'll give you just a second. Great. Okay.
Okay, folks, thank you. We need to
What
turn
an
our attention
amazing
back to Dr.
audience.
Elmore, please.
How many of you just learned something? Did anyone just think of a new idea? This is how we're going to tackle climate change. You people in this room are how we're going to tackle this problem. Talking to each other, getting new ideas, brainstorming, and thinking about what changes you can make on an individual level. That's the solution. And the reason that's the solution is because it's the only opportunity we have. The reality is that large-scale governmental efforts to mitigate climate change aren't that successful. It's really hard to get a lot of people to commit to a problem that might take 100 years before it really impacts us drastically here in our backyard. And they're just not that good at prioritizing things that far down the road. In order for these stories to be more plentiful, to have more success stories, to really make an impact, it will be local communities that focus on sustainability. It will be individuals making individual choices that can improve the Earth for everyone. It will be technology that's built by 3 engineers that will change the world for the better. This is a really critical piece of information to always remind yourself when you have a bad day, when you have a long meeting, that you're the people who can help the world. It will have to be you because there's no one else. And now I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you very much. A round of applause. Okay, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll run the mic over to you. Oh, it's right in the front.
So all the charts and graphs you put up there look pretty cyclical as far as rises and falls. What's the average span between peaks that you see? I think that was a 1,000,000-year span that you put up there.
Yeah. The answer is 120,000 years. And the way that climate changes on a really large scale before humans is based on the shape of the Earth's rotation around the sun and how we tilt based on that rotation. So a lot of us think that we move in a circle around the sun. It's actually an oval, and that oval can kind of squish and relax. So the shape of our orbit changes on a 120,000 year cycle, and that's the dominant phase in recent changes of climate. Yeah, called eccentricity, the shape of our orbit around the sun.
Oh, I see one in the back.
What is an individual person's CO2 budget per year for the rest of their life?
Could you redefine that question? Do you mean what I think your budget should be, or what is it really?
I've always been wondering if there's a natural cycle to CO2. There are so many tons produced, so many tons absorbed by the Earth. To stay within the numbers we are at now, how much are we allowed to produce?
That is
And
such a
I got
good
an
question.
answer of 1 ton for the rest of my life from a friend of mine who's sort of an amateur climate scientist. And since I'm about 60 tons per year based on my zip code, we're in trouble.
Yeah. I don't know the exact number, but that is a really great calculation that we could definitely do. Essentially, part of the problem is that there's 7.5 billion of us. And population so much larger than it used to be. It's really hard to calculate the total CO2 usage. We know that things like airplane travel would destroy your trillion-ton aim in a year. I mean, that's one of the worst things you can do. I can do that calculation for you, but I don't have it handy. For all of you who are interested, there are lots of calculators online where you can estimate exactly how many tons of CO2 you're using based on the length of your commute, whether or not you eat meat, whether you wear leather, all these different aspects of your personal behavior. You can quantify exactly how much carbon they take. The harder piece is to quantify how much civilization takes. The fact that you drive on a road means that road had to be built by machines and all of these different processes. But I think we could get that number. I've never seen it.
If you'd like to run those calculations, I'd be happy to send it out to the group later.
I'll do my best, yeah.
And if anyone's interested in a carbon calculator, the little Davis Carter Scott postcard in your bag has a website on the back that has a carbon calculator. You can check your own.
I think one of the
usage.
most interesting things about calculating your carbon is, I don't know if that particular site has it, a lot of sites let you estimate your changes. So you can say, right now I drive this many miles, but if I drove 0 miles, what would my new carbon calculation be? And that can be really important for trying to make your personal changes.
Any other questions?
On the graph, it looks like there's been higher points than where we are currently, and then it's gone back down. What does that mean for us? So we're not currently at the worst we've been with CO2 emissions?
No, we are at the worst. Maybe we can pop back, oh, maybe I can do it. Yeah, so CO2 in this graph is in blue. And what is shown as 0 on the actual graph is 1800. And then I've drawn in blue, because I wanted to highlight that we are off the charts. So I've highlighted in blue that we're now basically double the change from a glacial period down at the bottom to today. So everyone know woolly mammoths and that there was an ice cap that extended all the way down to New York at the last glacial maximum, the last ice age, we usually call it. That's shown by the this most recent low point here, about 20,000 years ago, is an ice age, where we had woolly mammoths roaming around, and we had ice covering all of North America down to the line where Cape Cod is, actually down to Long Island. It's 20,000 years ago. The change in CO2 from that to today, we have now taken that same amount of CO2 and added it to the atmosphere on top of that change. So we're off the charts. We're double where we should be.
Thank you. And the last question.
Thank you for your presentation. With everything that you've said, the data and the science that's out there and the challenges that we face, it seems to me that life as we know it is going to change. We're not going to continue to live the way we're living now. There are obstacles to having that consciousness take place in people's minds. You've got governments and multinationals, our food distribution and production systems, all of these things that are built in to our reality and how we live day to day. It's going to take time to transform and embrace and adopt this. Can you speak to that challenge?
Yeah, it's massive. Part of the barrier to action is that we can say a lot about what's happened in the past and even what's happened in the recent past. Making predictions into the future is really hard. So the question of how quickly will sea level rise, to take just a piece of the puzzle, how quickly will sea level rise? Does everyone need to move away from the beach right now? Is a really hard thing to estimate. There are some people who say within 3 years, we're going to have a massive change. There's others who say it will be a much, much longer time before sea level rises a meter in order to necessitate all these people from moving. And the difficulty in predicting the future is the biggest barrier to change. I agree, we need to start making accommodations. There are multinationals who are focused on making that change. One of the most interesting pieces, without getting too political, is that our military has a whole bunch of contingency plans based on sea level rise, based on rising temperatures, based on how to get their supply chain to keep working even in 2 degree, 3 degree, 4 degree warmer environments. So there are lots of people thinking about it. The barrier is whether large-scale governments are willing to pay money to put any of that into action, and that answer so far has been no.
Okay, thank you very much. Very enlightening, a little scary.
A little scary, it's okay.
That's why we're here, to learn and to share with each other. So we are going to take a